Hello and welcome to another Forge Fireside. I'm Brian Ellerman, the founding executive director of Arizona Forge, which is finding opportunities and resources to grow entrepreneurs. Every month we meet with a different founder, investor, entrepreneur to talk about their personal journey from where they began to where they are now, and to show people how every journey is unique and every entrepreneur has a story to tell. With me this morning is Cindy Jordan, the CEO and founder of Pyx Health. Full disclosure, I am an investor in Pyx Health and a big cheerleader, so I'm especially thrilled to have Cindy on today to talk with me. Welcome, Cindy.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Love it. So, we always kind of follow a certain component of script, which is, let's go back to your school days.
Okay.
And what did you study? Where did you study? How were you as a student?
So I grew up on the East Coast in the Washington, D.C. area, and even before I went to college, grew up in a super blue collar kind of family. And I remember going to my mom and saying, "Hey, I want to go to college." And she was like, "Well, why?" Because to them, you sort of, you did what you were going to do, and then you got yourself into a job with a pension and worked hard. And I said, I have a feeling that I want to do more than that. And so thankfully I was able to leverage an athletic scholarship, and I went to George Mason, which is on the East Coast, and I studied government and politics, political science.
What sport did you play?
Softball.
Softball?
And all of you U of A fans out there, I would never have made the U of A team.
Well,
I wasn't that good.
They are major league teams. So.
Yeah, they're the best. And when I was in college, I think they won the NCAA championship. I played Division I, but they won 3 of the 4 years that I was in college. So there you go.
Mike Candrea
yes.
Legacy. So you studied government, did you say?
Government politics. It's a political science degree.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And you immediately, when you graduated, you went into a career of government and policy, correct?
No, not at all. It's so funny. It's like you think about going into school I was 17. I was a year younger. And you don't know. You have no idea. I just lived in D.C., and that was what everybody did. And I had a capacity for it, so that's what I chose. I think deep down, though, if I look back at just like my journey in my life, I always felt like I wanted to help people. It was, sort of just a part of me. And so out of school, I remember I told you I was an athlete.
Yeah.
And so at the field house, there would often be folks recruiting there, and it was usually military and police, because most particularly recruiting women, because it was hard to find women who had a degree and could pass the physical, So I don't know. I graduated May 13th, 1993, and it was like April, and I didn't have a job and needed one. And so there was the Montgomery County Police Department, which is in the DC area, was there, and I signed up. And the day I graduated, I was offered a job there and started in the police academy 2 weeks later. And then my mom said, "See, you didn't need to go to college."
I was about to say, Mom was right, wasn't she?
She totally was.
The police weren't looking for your college degree.
No, if you ever want to be promoted past a certain, you have to have a college degree, but that wasn't why I was being recruited, no.
Wow. So then you were a cop in the D.C. area. How long did you do that?
So I did it 5 years.
Okay.
Didn't really love that profession. Not knocking on the profession. It's a really hard job, and frankly, it's only gotten harder. It just, for me, the idea of paramilitary reporting structure was, you literally move through the ranks because of time in, not because of merit. And that was difficult for me to absorb. Plus, you do see a very dark side of humanity. It's very rare where someone's like, "Oh, the police. Oh, I'm so happy to see you." It's generally like, "Why are you pulling me over? Why are you here?" That kind of thing. So I worked 4 of the 5 years permanent midnights, 8 at night till 6 in the morning. And I think this was the first time that, and we'll talk about this later, that I started to feel like actually what loneliness was. I was lonely. I drove in a cruiser by myself in the middle of the night. I slept when everybody else was working. So at 5 years to the day, I was like, I need to get out of this.
I have an adage with my kids that nothing good happens after 10 p.m.
Nothing.
And you were literally working that time.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. And I was 21, you know, I mean, I'm sure some of the students, I'm 21, I had a cruiser and a gun, and, you know, and I'm meant to go out there and sort of solve problems. I will tell you, I always say this, that experience made me the entrepreneur I am today. One, it taught me how to have a very fast and solid EQ. You have to size up the human condition quickly, or it could go south, right? And number two, it gave me perspective. And so I always, this is a joke in the office, when we're having a bad day or we didn't land a contract, I'm like, let me tell you about the time I got stabbed in my ankle. Like, that was a really, really bad day. We'll get over this not signing the contract.
Yeah, it is all relative, and
Yep.
it's a matter of perspective. So you mentioned, you know, part of being formative to becoming an entrepreneur. What was your first startup?
So my first startup was a company called Medical Referral Source.
Okay.
Between then, the police department and starting up, I actually I did use my degree. Got into politics in DC. Very hard to move from being a police officer to getting an office job. I like to tell this story because back then they used to put job announcements in the Sunday paper, you know, and they cost a lot of money. So I applied for this paper, this job at a nonprofit, and probably 6 weeks in a row and never heard. So I call there, I find out who the hiring person is, and I call her till she answers the phone. And I say, her name was Loretta, I'll never forget it. I said, Loretta, this is Cindy Jordan. I've applied for that job 6 times. You keep running it in the Sunday paper. You clearly haven't hired. Like, why won't you give me an interview? And she's like, oh, you're the cop. That's literally what she says to me. So I said, look, can I come down? Just give me 20 minutes of your time and I'll leave you. And I was there for 3.5 hours, got the job, showed up my first day and didn't know how to turn a computer off because I had been riding in a cruiser. Like I didn't know that in the start button is where you hit to get and now I run a tech company. So if that's not you know. But what I did at that job was fundraise. And that's important because it's just like when you're out there in the beginning days of entrepreneurship and you're getting people behind your dream. My job was to fundraise for candidates. And that's elusive, right? Like, so you're not the candidate yourself, but you're trying to get people to believe in the candidate's passion. So had a little bit of a knack for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then I moved to Tucson, worked here in a marketing firm as the lead strategist, did very much what I did in politics, which is like look at numbers and decide messaging and figure out how to get people through it. And then in 2008, in the big crash, we all were unemployed. So I went to the 2 women that owned the firm. It was LP&G. Anybody in Tucson would have known them. And I said, hey guys, listen, I know we just laid off 28 people. And I know it feels pretty bleak, but we're going to start a company. We're going to do it today. And they were like, are you out of your mind? And I'm like, no, Ann, listen to this. You guys are going to put the first money in because the most I had made in my life up until that point in a year was $65,000, right? So I said, you're going to put the money in and we're going to like run it out of the space for the agency. And it was a medical business. I had represented a large medical client and realized that the way that money or people was moving through the medical system, you know, it used to be you'd go to your doctor, like in my dad's, time, and you'd say, hey, I need to go see a dermatologist, and your doctor would know the dermatologist personally and refer you, right? Well, now you've got payers in the mix. You had clinically integrated networks, and so the people making the referrals was the medical assistant at the front desk, not the doctor anymore. So we built a platform for them that helped them find the right solution for referrals. And that was my first company, and it was born out of a market crash.
And so what was the, what kind of trajectory did that company go on in terms of, starting from the interesting origins of borrowed space and someone else's money to, you eventually, it went on to an exit, right? To an acquisition?
Yeah, I mean, interesting when, you think about the entrepreneurial journey. I was 37 at the time, so I'm older than most starting a company. I had a baby that was under 1 year old. I had a mortgage. And I bring this up to say everyone thinks to be an entrepreneur that you need to, not get paid, live in your parents' garage for 7 years and be 20. That's not the case, right? Like there are many paths to success. But I had never raised money for a company before. And so I talked about MRS everywhere, birthday parties, barbecues. It got to the point where my family was like, if you come and talk about your company again, like don't show. But funerals. But what happened was I met a guy named Kirk, and he's in the Tucson community, and he attached to it, and it was all at a barbecue. And Kirk was connected to investors. So I sold Kirk on the dream, and then after a little while, he opened up his Rolodex to me. And so the path of that company was all angels. We raised, for the totality of the company, no more than $2 million. In fact, I think it was way under that. Because of Kirk, I got invited to the Desert Angels and did my first ever 12-minute pitch. I even did a pitch competition here at the university, and the PowerPoint broke.
Oh.
So I did it all on a whiteboard, the entire thing, So what happened was, I think the message I'm trying to say here is you don't have to have money. You don't have to have an Ivy League degree. You don't have to be able to not take a paycheck for a year to actually start and fund a company. And that's what we did with that. So we got some traction pretty quickly. It was a small company. We made it to a little over $2 million in revenue and realized at the time that we either were going to have to raise significantly because it was a heavy technology lift. Like you had to integrate into electronic medical records or sell to a strategic. And we made a very conscious decision to go find a strategic. And so we sold in less than 3 years. Investors made 11 times their money. And we did not use an investment banker, which I regret to this day, but we did just sort of find the company, went out after it, and then, I worked for the company that purchased the advisory board. I worked for them for 2 years. It was part of the earnout.
Okay. Kind of the golden handcuff, if you will.
It was sort of like that. I mean, it was enough money that you wouldn't want to walk away from it,
Well, and it's funny because I think when I met you, Curtis Gunn and Base Horner, both with the Desert Angels, had brought me to a meeting with you at a restaurant, and they said, first of all, they sold me on the meeting by saying, Cindy's awesome, we already had an exit with her, and now she's doing another company, and we want you to come along to help us because of the subject matter. And and that's such an endorsement when you have experienced investors who you say, I've got an idea, and because of your history and reputation, they're like, yep, we're in. Whatever it is, we're in. We just want to know more about it. So I think that spoke volumes about, their opinion, which in turn influenced my opinion.
That's great.
And why I ended up investing. And that was Pyx Health. So what was, I know that I've heard you tell the story, obviously, many times, but, for our audience, the origin of Pyx Health and what motivated you to start it.
Yeah, I really didn't think I would get back into healthcare IT because it's regulated. It's hard. Sales cycles are super long. You're either selling to systems or providers or payers. But in 2017, my stepdaughter had a really bad year, and I'll explain that in a second. And until then, I was doing a little consulting, and literally, I would go to the Roadhouse 3 times a week. I was living my best life. But she has this horrible year, and it was all around mental health. And she was an adult at the time and ended up kind of utilizing the healthcare system in an alarming way, meaning going to the ED a lot for problems that were not emergency room problems, but more indicative of mental health, like And then at the end of the year ended up in an inpatient facility. And that was when she was diagnosed with bipolar. And so when we kind of sat around a table as a family, I remember asking her very vividly, I'm like, I don't understand what happens when the wheels come off the bus. Like, what's first? Because, I'm a fixer. Most entrepreneurs are. I want to get ahead of it. I want to see the warning signs and stop it. And she talked about being lonely. And I said, wait a second. You come to Sunday dinner, you live with a roommate, you go to school. I don't get that. And she said, I feel like no one understands. And then I'm kind of alone in my journey. And so I started researching loneliness as a mental health sort of diagnosis, if you will. And at the time in 2017, we were the only developed country in the world that didn't treat loneliness like a diagnosable, treatable condition like depression and anxiety. And so I said, there's an opportunity here to make a difference. And so we formed the company, got our first client at the end of 2018, and really off of a connection from MRS. It was an executive that I'd sold to before, and I think if I didn't have that relationship, I never would have convinced them to take the flyer on a loneliness company. But what they did, because they were in the middle of a bid process in Medicaid, they wrote it in as an innovation and a point of differentiation, and they won. And so, we're off to the races, right? So that's how Pyx came to be.
And what's the origin of the name? I don't think I've ever asked you that.
Oh, okay. So I was researching names, and I found a constellation that was called Pyxis, so Pyxus. Okay. And that was what I wanted to name the company. And in fact, we never incorporated under that name, but we were, kind of talking about it. And then someone called me, a friend of mine, and goes, do you know that Pyxis is a massive pharmaceutical company that actually administers pharmaceutical drugs? And I was like, oh, so we should likely stay away from that, and then just landed on Pyx. But the constellation meant to guide and to help. And at that point, the folklore is that sailors used to use the Pyxis constellation to navigate around the ocean. And so to me, I thought of healthcare as this massive ocean that, a rogue wave can come anytime, and to have just something and someone that was in your corner. So that was Pyx.
Got it. Now, I don't think I've ever heard that.
A lot of people don't ask.
Well, I think so many companies spend so much time focused on what they do, and then you ask them, well, but why the name? And it's like, well, I don't know. It was the one we started with, and we never changed it. And so, I think having that intentionality says a lot too about where you're going.
Plus, I hated Medical Referral Source. It literally was just a description of what we did. And saying referral over and over and over again, I was like, okay, this next name is going to be cool if it's the last thing I do.
Nice. And now you have so let's describe what it is, because I think not everybody is maybe has seen it. Can you talk a little bit about what Pyx Health does, and especially your little character?
Yeah, so Pyx is really a tech-enabled services business. We still have very high gross margins, over 70%, but we do have humans involved. And so I personally believe that healthcare tech is very greedy. And what I mean by that is we go to the end user, we ask for data, and we just want to move it around the system and sort of benefit from it. It's very rare where a piece of healthcare technology actually solves a real pain point for the end user, and that was important to me. So we built the first iteration of the product before we signed our first client, and self-funded it, and spent a decent amount of money, close to $500,000, and then rolled it out to 300 of our closest friends and family. And I'll never forget, it was on my birthday weekend, and I used it for maybe a couple hours, started asking for some feedback, and people are being nice because they're your friends. It's inevitable. They can't tell you the truth. And so finally I put out on the chat that we were all on, I said, this thing stinks. It's so boring. And then that opened the floodgates. Everyone's like, yeah, I don't really think this is. And so this is one of the lessons I always say to entrepreneurs. You cannot be afraid to pivot. I scrapped the entire thing. I didn't use 1 ounce of that code in what is currently Pyx, and I wasn't afraid to walk away from the money. And so what I did, by not being greedy about my share, that's when I actually took on a few, what I call friends and family round, and we started over, and that's when Pyxer was born. He was born February 15th, 2008 at 2:12 in the morning in an email from me, and we do celebrate his birthday. I said, we have got to create a personality inside the platform. If we're going to work with people around loneliness and other mental health issues and social determinants, they're going to have to trust it. And so I wanted the spirit of the platform to be like a friend in a coffee shop. If you and I went to coffee and you knew I suffered from depression and we sat down, the first thing you wouldn't do, like healthcare tech does, is say, how's your depression?
Right.
Watch this video, read this article, do this. I'd be like, Brian, I'm never coming to coffee with you again, right? Instead, you would ask me how I'm doing. You'd kind of measure my sentiment, if you would, and then that would inform our conversation. And that's exactly what the bot does. His name is Pyxer. He tells jokes. He asks how you are. And the algorithm, of course, the whole time is running in the background. Even the way you respond to the jokes is something that we capture. Capture latent data. Are you talking to the bot in the middle of the night? That's not a good sign. Are you researching resources in the middle of the night? All of it. And we use evidence-based screenings. And this is important because when you're in healthcare, you can't create your own litmus test. You have to follow the litmus that's been out there. And I know a lot of biotech. It's the same thing. Software often thinks because it's software, it doesn't have to follow the same sort of rules. So we follow evidence-based screenings. We use the bot. And when the algorithm, and it does it quickly, within 3 interactions, throws a flag that someone's in trouble, and we do that by either having a bad evidence-based screening around loneliness or depression. We do that because they're interacting negatively with the bot, or they say they have some kind of urgent social determinants of health need, like food or transportation or housing. Then that throws a flag over to the humans in the company, and they're all called Andy.
Okay.
And that stands for authentic, nurturing, dependable, your friend. They're peer support certified, overseen by a clinician, but they're not clinicians themselves.
Okay.
And that's what keeps the model affordable and also scalable. Because as everyone knows, we are in a horrible shortage around mental health professionals. And it's only going to get worse. So what those guys do, Andy then calls the end user. And then that is how the technology and the humans work together. And they provide intentional companionship. They'll help them get the food they need. They'll walk them through any kind of resource. 96% of the time on the phone when someone says they have a need, we solve it.
Wow. And I do want to talk too about, because one of the things I recall from the beginning is being able to capture and demonstrate efficacy data, and how important that has been in terms of the payers who then come on board. But I think also important to mention the typical demographic of your user is what?
Well, back then it was Medicaid and it was 54-year-old men, but now we're in 76 markets and we're serving people from 14 to 104. So we split the demographic into adults and youth. And so our average youth user is 17.
Okay. And
we should talk about at some point like how horribly lonely the 14 to 24-year-old generation is. And then in our adult user, the average user is 44. And then for 65 and plus, our average user is 72.
Wow. Yeah, you've definitely come a long way from those original origins of dealing with a particular elderly segment to now having such a broad range of users and ages. So that obviously then complicates that whole efficacy and data capture.
Yep.
So I think this, again, if we want to talk about the entrepreneurial journeys and how people build companies, data is king. And being able to show that the thing you think is the best really is, as opposed to just trust me, take my word for it. So how have you convinced payers to come and support you through the data that you've captured?
Yeah, so in my first company, when I sold to the advisory board, very shortly thereafter, they bought another company, and the guy, the entrepreneur, and I were often on the road together. And he had less revenue than I did and got paid more. So one night we were at the bar, and I said, okay, I gotta know. Like, how did you do this? And he said that in his first client, which was a healthcare system, he contractually obligated them to conduct an independent case study about the efficacy of his program. So I did the same in my first client. Now, two things could happen. It could be amazing, and you're off to the races. Now you have third-party verified data that it works. And for us, it was around cost reduction in ED utilization, inpatient stay, and overall what they call PMPM, per member per month. You want to drop that fee. Also, we found that we were increasing med adherence spend, which is good in things like insulin. So you want people back on their insulin and not going to the emergency room, right? Or the second thing that can happen is that you get a very bad result, and you cannot be afraid to take that data and pivot, turn around, like scrap, whatever you have to do. And I was prepared to do either. So they ran it. It was statistically valid for all of our stat people out there. It had a p-value of 0.001, so completely defendable. And the numbers were unbelievable. It's one of like my most fond memories of doing Pyx. And then that was it, Brian, you're right. All we did everywhere, social media, on the phone, anywhere we went, we just led with the data. Well,
and so now where are we at? What's going on in the Pyx Health world? Because it sounds like you've really, you're hitting on all cylinders. You've got, gone from that early startup story to being in multiple markets with numerous, customers across different segments. So where's Pyx Health headed? Yeah, so I would say, I know you asked me a question, but I'm going to go backwards again. All right. I would say that once the pandemic hit, and you're a loneliness company, and you're sort of trying to convince that addressing loneliness is smart because of the data and the cost savings, executives, and this is so important in sales and everything you do, after the pandemic, executives understood what it was like to feel lonely and isolated. And that just changed everything, right? So during the pandemic, I had just closed a Series A5 round, and I went to my board and I said, we've got to bring in some institutional money. And they're like, you are out of your mind. We just closed a round, you're flush in cash. And I said, listen, if it blows up the way I feel like it's going to, we're going to be undercapitalized. And so I went out and found a private equity group that I was introduced to that was really good people. And the woman that was the managing partner, she recapped her company. She was the founder, recapped it three times, and ended up selling for $1.9 billion. And so you don't find many people who do that, and you don't find many women who do that. Right. And we just got to know each other. So we were way outside their investment thesis. We hadn't even done, at that point we were at $2 million in revenue, not profitable. And she went to bat and put in a minority investment into the company. And what they did for us was give us the ability to hire literally a world-class leadership team. So when the tsunami came, and it did, we were ready. So Pyx, also during that time, right after the investment, back to my stepdaughter, she ended up passing away. She, basically just lost her struggle with mental health issues. And what happened to the company was undescribable. Like, everybody started rallying around this idea that if this could happen to me and my family, it could happen to anyone. And it still is so much a pillar of what we do. And I believe, like, when people talk about success and tailwinds, I really think that Riley's story is the reason why we have such profound tailwinds. So we just blew up. We have now close to 200 employees. We're in 76 markets. We're in almost every state in the country. We're in a process. Okay. We're thick in it, and I hired a banker this time, and we'll likely, hopefully, find a new partner, a majority partner, so that we can
start taking Pyx outside of CMS, because we all of our business is in Medicaid and Medicare with payers.
Yeah.
And start moving into the self-insured employer market, specifically serving dependents. Mm-hmm. So think if I'm an employee of the U of A and I'm worried about my 15, 16, 17-year-old and mental health, like Pyx would be offered as a benefit, and also to get into the university setting. Universities are not equipped for the mental health crisis that is coming, and we're going to have to think outside the box. We're not going to be able to just staff the student health center and address the mental health crisis. We're going to have to use companies like Pyx. So that's where we're going next.
So I really appreciate that comment, because I know the pandemic, I watched a lot of that play out for different individuals, where you could just see the isolation set in, and I think it was a lonely time for a lot of people.
Yep.
And so it's great to know that there's a tool like Pyx out there to help people through that, and also that there are human beings behind it who can intervene, when necessary. I think that's a beautiful model. I want to kind of touch a little bit on you as a leader, and what kinds of values you instill both in your team and that you want to see in the company, because I think we spend a lot of time too coaching entrepreneurs to be better human beings.
Yep.
It's great to be a business person and have that acumen, but you also need to be a good human being. And so tell me a little bit about what are some of the values that you really, both you have personalized, but also that you try to instill in your team.
Yeah, we actually thought a lot about this, right? Not just as it relates to me, but like what are the values that we want as we scaled and grew. So, we were, I think, number 62 on the Inc. 5,000 list in healthcare. So if you think about that, we started that year with 13 employees and ended with 100. And so if you don't have a value structure that people can glam onto, it's going to go badly. So that same firm I told you about, they had a guy that they used for culture. I'm going to give a shout out to Brian Kite, and he taught culture to the NFL. And so he comes into our company and he's like, look, you have to, it's not words on a wall, it's not integrity and, all the stuff we've seen in every corporate culture environment. It is, what are your beliefs? What are the behaviors that you want associated with those beliefs, and what are those outcomes going to be? And I'll give you just a small example. So one of our beliefs was to bring your love to work. And I can promise you that there aren't a lot of companies that use the word love in business, and let alone require it as a part of being an employee there. The behavior associated with bringing your love to work is like, listen to understand. So that's just a small example. And there's 3 beliefs and 3 behaviors on each belief. And a lot of it did center around me and what I felt like I wanted to see and the kind of workplace I wanted to build. I believe that leaders who are humble, I try to do that all the time. And believe me when I tell you that Pyx is not successful because of me. It is successful because of the humans that are there. I also feel like entrepreneurs, because we often are in it for the money, and believe me, the money is great, but if the money is the reason why you're getting into it, think about this. Less than 1% of startups make it? The money can't be the reason.
Right.
That's not going to get you through the hard times. And so I think if you can be humble, if you can put a solid culture in place that reflects who you are, and if you're not greedy, meaning if you're willing to not only bring on outside advisors for advice, but bring in people that bring money and experience. And, am I telling you not to worry about dilution? No, but I'm saying that dilution shouldn't lead the day. Then I think you can build a company. This year we'll probably buy a company or 2. And so all this work we did around culture and being humble and forgiving. We talk a lot about forgiveness at work because none of us are perfect. And if we're not going to forgive each other, then what are we going to do? We're going to, particularly when a lot of people work from home, we're going to start getting snarky. And if you can do those things, I think that you have a scalable a scalable, growing concern, if you will.
All right. Yeah, and I love that too in your story of scrapping the first version, even though you were the one who was personally invested in it. And
100%.
I think it is, what do they call it, the sunk fallacy or sunk cost fallacy, right? Well, I did it, so I need to keep going. And I think your willingness to look around and ask for input, and then, given the input, face that and completely start over, it says a lot. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs could really take that to heart. So speaking of, we use a term we call entrepreneurial mindset, and it isn't necessarily, it's not the startup component, it's really about the problem solving. And you already touched on that, that entrepreneurs like to dive in and fix and so on. When I say entrepreneurial mindset, what are some of the things that come to your mind?
I mean, I've always felt like I had a chip on my shoulder, that I had something to prove, and I feel like that helped. It just always made me feel like the underdog. So I think part of an entrepreneurial mindset, even in the second company, the story you told about how we met, I didn't care that I already had a success. As far as I was concerned, I was right back in that place, trying to raise money, trying to find the right people. Like I felt scrappy. And I love when people tell me that I can't do it, or that I'm not the prototypical entrepreneur, or that I'm a woman, I'm 51. Like this is not this isn't. So that was the fuel to the fire for me. As far as entrepreneurial mindset goes, I think I talked about it. I feel like you have to be humble. I feel like you have to be gracious. I think generosity is important. I know there's lots of people who would say, that you have to sort of work through and have, the steel mind. I think those things are obviously important, but it's being human that is more important. The turnover rate at my company is wildly low, particularly for a call center. And I think it's because our entire leadership leads with these qualities.
I want to put out a reminder, if you have a question, please post it in the Q&A, and we will come to it momentarily. We're just about to that Q&A segment. I think the last thing I wanted to ask you about is knowing that we often have a number of students who tune in and or watch the video. What would be your message to them?
I would say that we always talk about entrepreneurs and success. Success is a word we throw around all the time, right? That success is not elusive, meaning it isn't this thing out in the ether that you're running towards. Success is self-defined. So does your company have to go on to sell for hundreds of millions of dollars? No. the first one didn't, MRS didn't. It was a really small exit, but it was success. And so what I would say to students who are getting really into this is define your own success. Don't let someone do that for you, and no one.
Yeah, I think that's a great message, and we certainly spend a lot of our time also trying to help students recognize the entrepreneur in themselves.
Yeah.
We've had situations where we've asked students, do you think you're an entrepreneur? Nah. Well, do you have a side hustle? Well, yeah. Okay, so why are you not an entrepreneur if you have a side hustle?
What do they say? I'm curious.
I think somehow they just associate the side hustle with, well, everybody does, or it's just the thing that I do, but I don't think it's going to be. I think it's that defining success, right? They're looking at it as, well, I'm never going to get rich doing this side hustle, therefore
exactly.
I'm not entrepreneurial, and those are two very different things.
Yep.
So do we have any questions? No questions at this time. Well, again, if you do have any, please post them on the Q&A. We have definitely covered a lot of territory here today,
yeah.
So I appreciate that. I think the last part I want to head toward is what is what is the future of mental health? I often joke that mental health is an oxymoron, or that they're a contradiction of terms because we don't seem to understand how to put the two things together. You go to the doctor and the doctor will look at your physical, body, but has almost no understanding of your mind. So where do you see us headed in terms of mental health?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. We talk about this a lot. Physical health and mental health from a health insurance perspective, we're treated completely differently. Like they weren't combined, which is so crazy to me because now there's a lot of studies that show that actually mental health and social determinants, meaning the factors of your life, are more powerful to your physical health than actually the ailment itself. Where do I think it's going? That's a good question. I think that it is ripe for innovation, and I'm not just saying this self-serving for Pyx, I mean innovation across the board. The actual delivery model in physical health, which is like, see a provider, provider makes assessment, provider prescribes you drugs, and then you go on and get better, is not gonna work in mental health. We're going to have to think outside the box. We're gonna have to leverage cost-effective. We talked about margin. If all my Andes were psychologists, the company would be under, right? So I think that's what's going to have to, plus I think that we can't just rely on the healthcare system to do it. It's what I was talking about from the university setting. I'm sure you saw, this was probably like 6 months ago now, what happened to Yale when their mental health policy got leaked. They basically said, if you have a mental health issue, we want you to go home. We want you to get better, and then you will be allowed to reapply.
Wow.
And so mental health isn't going to be fixed unless we all believe that it's part of our role to help solve it. All of the research. This is one interesting stat. If you think about self-insured employers, so these are folks that pay their own healthcare costs, which is the majority of the workforce. The majority of the spend in 5 years, 40%, not majority, but 40% of the spend in 5 years is going to be not on the employee, not on physical health, but on the dependent's mental health. So it's a crisis and it's coming. And I think organizations that get ahead of it are gonna,
Well, and it's kind of sad, personally editorializing here for a moment, but the fact that our healthcare and changes in healthcare seem to be mandated and dictated by cost structure rather than efficacy.
Follow the dollar.
Yeah, and it's going to be because employers eventually say enough's enough. I'm paying too much for this healthcare. What do we do to change it? And being able to recognize the impact that mental health has on physical health. I think for too long you would have these sort of phantom symptoms that would show up, and those are physical. And if we'd taken some time to think about the mental health contribution to that, you might have recognized different patterns, especially on dependency. Do we have a question? Yeah.
Julie says, I'm curious about Cindy's thoughts regarding mental health practices, specifically for entrepreneurs, since we know it can be an intense lifestyle with lots of demands on yourself.
That is a great question. Well, two things. At Pyx, I talked about the Andes. We actually employ a full-time therapist just for our staff. So that's important because if you think about what they hear. But if I think about it from an executive perspective, it's funny, a couple of years ago I had basically a stomach issue and they could not find a physical reason for it. So finally one doctor is like, hey, do you have a stressful job? And I was like, yes. And he goes, well, don't you know the stomach is the third brain? I'm like, what are you talking about? And it really opened up to me. So I do believe that there is a space for folks to get into. You and I were talking about this off camera. Entrepreneur executives are like athletes. You have to take care of the mental side of the business as much as the physical. And I can, say, oh, you should meditate, you should do this. But frankly, what works for you is not going to work for the next person. But it is so important to nurture your mental health while you're running a business. And you can do that by you know, like I said, like we have a full-time therapist on staff.
All right. That's a great question, though, because I think there's almost this I don't know, stereotype of the entrepreneur who's just so driven that at all costs, and you know, sleepless, working all hours of the day. You know, effectively we have sort of glorified the idea of imbalance.
Yes, we have.
And you know, so I think it sounds to me like you have really tried to, both for yourself and for your organization, to refocus people on that that balance and putting the values ahead of the business, you know, money at all costs, et cetera. Which I think what's great about that is that then the success still follows.
Oh yeah, it comes. I mean, we do a couple other cool things. Like one, I like people not to work on Sunday. So at all costs, we try to do that. Number two, we give half the staff every other Friday off. And everyone thought I was crazy to do that in a call center environment because it's a logistical nightmare. Our productivity went up by almost 26%. And if it is your Friday and you are working, we call it no meeting Fridays. Like, take a meeting if you have to, but don't put internal meetings on the calendar. And these are the things, you'd be surprised about how much relief that brings. We call them Fridays. Like, they're awesome. It's quiet, you get stuff done, or you can go to the doctor or do whatever things you have to do that's hard to do on the weekend. So I agree with you. We've over-romanticized working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that doesn't do, frankly, that's burnout. You're not going to make it more than a few years if you work like that.
We also have a meetingless Friday.
Don't you love it?
It's the day I can finally catch up on all the emails and start to plan for the week ahead, because otherwise you're just on a treadmill running from meeting to meeting.
Yeah.
So I love it.
Another cool thing that we do is we have a platform called Motivosity, and what that is you give your employees money every month, and they cannot spend it on themselves. They have to gift it to other employees, and then you can go to the marketplace and use that money to buy things, and you can buy anything from Pyx swag to gift cards. But we put a lot of wellness things in there, like, you know, a massage or this or that, and encourage them to take care of themselves first. In the Motivosity platform.
That's awesome. Well, I think we are coming to a close. I want to thank Cindy for your time today and meeting with me.
Happy to be here.
Being another esteemed Forge Fireside guest, and particularly telling the story, you know, of your own journey from, you know, the government political policy side of college, through being a cop in D.C. to your first startup to Pyx Health, and what sounds like a very beautiful trajectory for the company and for yourself. And obviously, we're thrilled that you are a part of the Tucson ecosystem. That's maybe the part that we really love to bring home here. So.
Me too, and I would never change it. In fact, I think building a business in a tier 2 city like this is genius. You're not competing for talent. We're next to a university that has all kinds of good talent. Tucson has been so good to our company. I can't even imagine even being in Phoenix. Like, this is the place to be.
Wonderful. Well, we're glad to have you, and thanks for being my guest today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful day.